If you don't want to be part of the recording for posterity, that is fine. You don't need to. The easiest way to avoid being part of the recording is just to stay muted, and you will not be recorded. You can ask questions in the chat when we get to the audience Q&A, and I will relay them to our guest authors this evening. It does look like folks are settled. I have a lovely introduction that David wrote for our guest authors before he lost power and disappeared this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share his words, not mine, sadly. I know that he's very sad at home that he is not here at the moment. So David wrote, "It is a great pleasure to finally get to introduce Megan Giddings and her devastating novel, Lakewood. Megan was going to join us for our annual literary festival, Booktopia, in May, but the pandemic, of course, intervened, and that was the time during which I read this novel. David's wife is a midwife, and while he was reading this novel, we talked a lot about how being Black is a risk factor in pregnancy, that it's dangerous to your health. There's one scene in Lakewood where the main character, Lena, is being held by one of the white medical observers, and we gradually realize that he's touching her to remind himself that she is a person. Lakewood is a terrifying exploration of why being Black is dangerous to your health in this country. I'm really so glad that we're finally doing this event. And we're certainly making the most of this new medium because Megan is joined by Maisy Card. Maisy's debut novel, These Ghosts Are Family, has been called stunning, kaleidoscopic, masterful, compassionate, and thrilling. Entertainment Weekly, Lit Hub, The Millions, Rumpus, and Electric Literature have all named it one of the most anticipated books of the year, while Buzz Magazine went ahead and named it a top new book for the new decade. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Live, Maisy Card and Megan Giddings.
Thanks for having us, Rachel. So I'm going to read very briefly from Lakewood, and thanks everyone who has bought it so far. I'm excited to talk to you. And all you need to know before I start reading is that, and you'll learn this on page 1 if you haven't read it, is that Lena's grandmother has died. And by the end of chapter 1, you'll find out her family has a lot of debt and she needs to figure out how to support herself and her mother. Lena was told that to maintain privacy, all of their buildings were disguised as part of Great Lakes Shipping Company. The closest intake office to Lena happened to only be a 1.5 mile walk from her dorm. She recognized the address when they said it. Most of the building had a rich person store feel, like the Allwood toy store and a high-end Taiwanese restaurant that Lena always wanted to try, but couldn't convince herself to pay $25 for an entree. Great Lakes Shipping Company, the woman on the phone said, was on floor 2. When you go up the stairs, walk past the drinking fountains, and then it's right across from the olive oil shop, the one called Living Liquid. It's easy to miss, the woman said, and she was right. Lena's eyes didn't register it the first time with its gray curtains over the window and the cream on white logo. She walked down to the end of the hall, turned around, and went back. The olive oil shop was brightly lit, rows of copper dispensers, posters of Italy on the wall. A man was filling up a styrofoam cup clearly meant for coffee with habanero-infused oil. Lena considered going in. There were containers of bread next to each dispenser. And she wanted to try some of it, but she also wanted to see if he was truly going to drink it. It was better, though, to be early, Lena decided as she walked inside the office. Inside, a white woman with a haircut that looked as if she'd shown a stylist a picture of a motorcycle helmet and said, "Please give me this look," was waiting. "Your IDs." Lena fished her wallet out of her coat pocket. The woman was wearing a navy pantsuit with an American flag pinned on the lapel. There was a badge clipped to her waistband. Walking over to her, Lena bumped into a small table and knocked over a stack of magazines. When she bent to pick them up, the woman told her to just leave it. Her tone was as if Lena had spent hours knocking over the magazines and picking them up, straightening them, just to knock them over again, and she just couldn't take it anymore. Lena handed over the IDs. "Looks good. Now we have some forms for you to fill out." She led Lena into what might have been the greatest room in the world. Everything in it, chairs, desks, pens, flooring, wall tile, the fire extinguisher, elephant gray. The strangeness of the room and the woman's brusque attitude made Lena want to joke. She wanted to find a way to rescue herself from her discomfort. Instead, she reminded herself that now was the time to be pleasant. Don't be weird. Don't embarrass yourself. Page 1 of the forms asked for the basics: address, full legal name, place of birth, how she'd found out about the study, email address, emergency contacts. Have you ever been a participant in any other clinical studies? No, Lena wrote. Page 2 reminded her that to participate in the Lakewood project was to consent to unnecessary diminishment of her privacy. If you consent to this, provide all your passwords for social media, email addresses, phone passcode. Also provide any potential answers you can think of for standard security questions, such as the make of your first car, the name of your childhood pet, your mother's maiden name. Lena coughed. May I have a glass of water? Lena stared at the white paper, let the words go out of focus. The woman's attitudes, her questions, they all made a small voice in her own head say, "You're already feeling weird. Get out of here." Her grandmother had cleaned houses, pulled the hair and gunk out of tubs and sinks, catered on the weekends, babysat, took odd jobs, worked for people who said she were proof that God had a sense of humor. Your grandmother gave you everything. You're the one in charge now. It's fine. Don't be weird about this. Lena flipped the page. At the top it said welcome in bold underlined type. Our most precious resources in this country are patriots like you, those who are willing to give of themselves. Your contribution will help end suffering and unhappiness. So Lena put down her pen. This is a government program? And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Rachel, for inviting me. I'm going to read the end of the first chapter of my novel, which I haven't tried to read before. All you really need to know is that the book is about a man, or starts out being about a man named Abel Paisley who faked his own death. In the 70s and in the present day Harlem, he wants to tell both his daughter, who he abandoned in Jamaica, and his daughter, who he had once he took another person's name, and his granddaughter, like who he actually is. So the first chapter is written in second person. So I'm going to read just the last section. Now let's say that you are a dead woman, 6 years on the other side, whose husband let you believe he was dead. When you were alive, they called you Vera, but here there is no need for names. You did not know the truth about your husband until your own death, but the timing of the knowledge made it no less infuriating. You have analyzed all of the years you spent mad with guilt, thinking you were the one who sent him to his grave. Death is just one long therapy session. You have gone over every second of your life and divided them into the misery you caused and the misery others caused you. You have been waiting for 6 years for this motherfucker to die, and you know that the day has finally arrived. You look at the elaborate theater that your former husband is producing and you laugh, or you imagine yourself laughing. You no longer have a mouth or a face. He has asked the women down to the brownstones parlor. He has your daughter who he barely even knew, help him move from his wheelchair to his favorite rocking chair, which he thinks makes him appear wise. Clearly, none of the women want to be there. The three of them settle side by side on a crushed velvet settee, barely listening, unaware of their blood connection. You are there in the room with them, waiting for Abel to gather up his nerve. You have decided to choose one person in his house to be the catalyst of his death, to be briefly possessed by you long enough to get the deed done. But the question of who has stumped you. Who will hurt him the most? You look at your own daughter, Irene, think she's owed the revenge, but you can see both the past and the future and know that giving her guilt to carry is not doing her any favors. There is a cruel impulse inside her, one that you gave her, that you do not want to feed. You know that most of her misery was brought about by you. When she dies, you will face your own reckoning, but for now, you have no plans to ruin her life any further. You look at the other two women, his daughter and granddaughter, the products of the weak woman he married after you. You have passed her in this place, for she's dead now too. You thought you'd have harsh words for her, that her day of reckoning would come, but you mostly feel sorry for her. You can feel her pining for Abel, pleading with you to spare him, until you've recently had no choice but to shut her out. You are so close to Abel as he tells them you can smell the Ray and nephew rum on his breath, but he can't see or sense you. When he says the words, "I was born Abel Paisley," you see your daughter shake her head. It will take her a while to understand that her father was alive all those years and left her behind, to suffer with you. When he says the words, after he says the words, "I was born Abel Paisley," his daughter Estelle exhales deeply, tears form in her eyes, but then she just bursts out laughing. For the first time in her life, she actually looks at her father with gratitude. She actually turns to the old man and says, "Thank you." Estelle puts her arm around her daughter, Karen, who, after he tells her, begins to cry. Irene stands up and crosses the room, kneeling before Abel, and for a moment you worry that she will choke the life out of him before you even have a chance to. Instead, she studies his face. She is thinking about the picture, the one under the mango tree, and when she recognizes him, she walks out of the room, collects her purse from the hall, and leaves for good, slamming the front door so hard it shakes you. You look at the two girls left in the room and reassure yourself that no matter which one ends him, it will actually be you. If only he could see you as he's falling. If you still had a mouth, you would be laughing. If you still had a body, you would dance. Thank you.
That was great. And I have a question to start. How did you decide to do the first chapter? Because it's so audacious that you do it in the second person in some ways. How did you decide that chapter would be in second person point of view?
The first chapter is actually one of the last chapters I wrote. It wasn't the last, but I think it was maybe among the kind of last three. So I think since the book was about Abel faking his own death, I just knew that I had to explain that at some point. And I kept trying to write it in first person and third person. It just didn't feel right. I almost felt like he came across as too empathetic. So I felt like in second person, the you kind of can change. So I just had kind of the you shift to different characters so you can kind of feel, how this decision affected them too.
Yeah, when I teach second person, I usually say it's the point of view where you can do alienation really well, or addiction, like the famous Bright Lights Big City use of it. But when I read it, I felt like I was possessed like them. It made me think of new ways to actually use the second person, just because you made the whole experience both feel so cohesive, and it was wonderful.
I thought that maybe we could also talk, because I think, because I reread your book just before, we agreed to do this, and I was thinking that one thing that our books do have in common is kind of that we straddle multiple genres, I think. And I thought what was interesting about your book is that, when I was reading it, for the most part, it felt like a thriller, but at the same time, and then later it kind of shifted into horror. Lena's experiences are so surreal that you kind of don't know what's going to happen next. But then at the beginning, though, I kind of felt like it felt so realistic to me in a way that a lot of books don't feel anymore. And I think it's not really being sold as a millennial novel, but I felt like the issues that she is dealing with feel so central to a lot of Black millennial experience. And I guess I was just wondering if you set out knowing kind of the book that you would write, the genres that you wanted to cover, or if it just kind of evolved that way.
I kind of have this natural distrust of genre in terms of, I think sometimes literary writers don't think that they're writing a genre, but they are. And I wanted to write a book that gets really close to realism in how I see realism. I don't think a day is static. I think that every single day, especially right now, even though, we're mostly in our homes, we're still fluctuating between thriller, horror sometimes, depending on what news you're reading. And then there's this natural shifting. You keep going through different perspectives and types of feelings and different types of moments throughout a day. So I was really conscious of trying to think of how close I could get to someone's lived experiences in this extraordinary thing. And when I tried to write it as a straight literary novel, it didn't feel real. It felt too like the author was always there, and you would feel safe. You would feel reassured. You wouldn't ever get lost in her, because my language and the choices I was making, they were a little too showy. So I went back and tried to shift my writing as much as possible to the actual like emotions and situation of the scene. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because I wondered how much, I think both our books kind of, there are still some questions that are unanswered in the end. And I wonder, I know for me, some of them I do answer, I just choose not to tell the reader in the end. But do you feel like there's more than you're putting down on the page, or do you just want to leave those questions unanswered for you as an author too?
I think I know more than what's on the page most of the time. Like, there are a few things where, like, it's the strange thing about being on virtual book tour, more people talk to you about your book in some ways. And so just like a few weeks ago, someone said something to me about Lakewood where they like pieced together different things I had written in the book. And I was like, well, that's a smarter answer than the one I had while writing it. So it's also like that thing where like, I don't want to own the book anymore because it's out there in the world. And I think I was so sure that when I sent this to my publisher that I would be like, this is the thing, this is how I'm going to explain it. And now seeing how much pleasure people are getting about their own theories and their own ideas, I'm glad I left a lot of questions unanswered, just because it's more fun to rethink everything I did than to kind of sit in all of the 5 years of work it took.
Yeah.
How do you feel about unanswered questions, though, in your fiction? Like, you touched on knowing, like, there are things that you didn't tell people, but are there things about these ghosts? I almost did this thing. I read your and Pam Zhang's book at the same time, and I keep in my head portmanteauing how much of these ghosts are family. But yeah.
Yeah, no, they're definitely, I think it's both, because I feel like there are some questions that I deliberately chose not to answer because I kind of wanted it to kind of be like reflect how people really learn about family history, especially if you come from a family like, well, I would say most Black Americans and most Black Caribbeans do, you come from a family where there's a lot that's unknown to you, because of a history of slavery and colonialism. So I just wanted the structure of the book to kind of like reflect, how I actually learned about my family history. So there were just questions that I couldn't answer. Like, I know that a lot of, multi-generational novels will like just go way back and kind of fill in the blanks. And I just like didn't want to do that here. So I left that out. But then there are other things that I do know the answer to, but then I think even as it was being edited, like copy edited, in the first chapter, somebody like is supposed to like, the ghost basically possesses somebody in the family and she causes Abel's death, but I never like answer that question. And like in the notes, they were like, who kills him? But I just kind of decided not to like say, because I thought it would change how people read the characters. So there are some things like that, some places where I did hold back. And then there are some places where, I just didn't want to make those questions, like those answers accessible.
Oh, that makes so much sense to me. And I think you touched on one other thing that we were both thinking about, which is control in both our novels. But also, when I was thinking about our books, I started thinking about a lot of the Black books I read this year. And I feel like it's a predominant theme that it might be the theme of, God, the last 5 years in some ways. It's control, and what does it mean to have a Black body in these spaces, as well as what happens when there are all, like, the root of your history is full of unknowns and questions, and how do you process and become a person in the, like, the way that you want to be while still grappling with these things.
Yeah, that's something I definitely thought about while, you know, I was writing. It's like, can these characters really have agency over their own lives if they don't have all the information, if they don't have access to all the information about themselves? And that's something that I definitely thought while reading your book, while Lena was going through, you know, the research study, like, can she consent when, you know, she doesn't really even know the purpose of the study that she's signing up for. And I thought it was interesting how you it fluctuates between, like, the question of, is the study itself racist, or, you know, is it racist because of structural racism? I mean, and I guess the answer is probably both, but, you know, like, I thought it was interesting that all the characters were people of color, and at times it does seem like the experiments are bordering on eugenics. So, you know, like those kind of experiments. And at times it just seems like a kind of like a weird marketing thing, you know, like it just like fluctuates between like being innocent and like sinister. And then it just ramps up, which I thought was done really well.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is based on just the history of the United States, where even outside of the history of Black Americans, like every once in a while, like the CIA dumps a bunch of files. And I mean, there are a lot of redacted things, but especially in the 60s through 80s, I'm sure there are more, but they haven't been dumped out yet, of just experiments performed on different members of the American people. So it's also like this history of all of us that is hard to just, like, I understand why it's not taught in schools. I don't even know if I would have gotten a lot in high school out of a high school teacher being like, and this is how the US experimented on everybody.
Yeah.
But it is still like this part of the foundation of our nation is that was a terrible rhyme. But it is this thing, like, Americans are often thought of as both the property of the government. If you can test on your people, you don't think of them as people. You think of them as whatever you need them to be to find out what you want.
Yeah. I thought something interesting that I thought about a lot when I was reading too, it's like, because I'm a librarian, like, and I think most people who go to library school read, like, I forgot the scientist's name or the social scientist's name, but she came up with the theory of information poverty. You know, and the idea is that, you know, poor people aren't just poor because they, you know, one of the results of being poor is not just that you lack access to material things or wealth, it's also that you lack access to information. You're less likely to be able to get the information you need, or like to know what to do with the information once you get it. You know, and I felt like that was a kind of interesting aspect of Lena's life too. You know, and that it was something that was kind of passed down from her, you know, her mom and her grandmother. This, like, you know, they all had these experiences that they really couldn't explain, and this kind of medical history that was denied to them. You know, and so Lena's not able to kind of make the best decision when she's offered this like amazing deal, because she doesn't have all the information, and she's, you know, she's impoverished in so many ways that she has to make the most extreme decision just to like get by. I thought that was interesting, and I guess that's something that my characters kind of experience. Not I think not to that level, but, you know, in some sense, like, I think all people who are descendants of enslaved people are, you know, lacking a lot of basic information about their family.
Will you email me when you remember the name of who wrote that? Because I've never heard about that before, and now I want to read more about it.
I think her name is Alfreda Chapman. I have to look it up, but yeah, the theory of information poverty.
I'm writing that down.
One thing I wanted to ask too was that you did mention, real life studies. I just was wondering if this, the actual study in your book was based on something like a real life study that happened in history. Oh, somebody said Alfreda Chapman, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. So most of the studies are based in some way in things that have happened, but the major one about memory, in some ways it is based off things like Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird, which were precursors to like very popular MK Ultra. And there seems to be this deep interest in just pushing people's boundaries, where in some of those studies, someone would essentially just be driven to the point of paranoia, and they would see how, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. They would see how much trust they would feel from their family versus authority figures. So the idea was kind of just, would alienation make you feel more loyal to your country? I swear every time I do one of these, the whole town has an emergency. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. And when were those studies done? Because I actually hadn't heard of them before.
Those were done, I'm pretty sure if I'm remembering right, because I did so much research for this, but I'm pretty sure these were the late 50s. And this was, and then I know some were starting in the 60s again, where everybody was getting worried about how people were reacting to different wars and upheaval and civil rights. But even from the late 50s, it was at least documented that there's a deep interest in how are people controlled. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, what's scary is that, I feel like in school we learned about the Tuskegee experiment, and I think I learned about the, the Zimbardo experiment where kids were allowed to act as prison guards, but there's so much more that we still don't know. So I think what was interesting too about your novel was that it's so possible, you know what I mean? Because even though the situations that she finds herself with seem so extreme, it's like the things that the government has done in the past are so extreme that it could, something like this could happen.
Yeah, I mean, even if, depending on who you ask. So the ACLU has a lot of articles about this, but the World Health Organization, like for Guantanamo Bay, they've declared it a research study because what they're researching is the effects of torture on the brain. And the US government does not agree with that classification. But even right now, there are things that some people in the world are calling research studies done actively, just because it can happen.
Yeah, I think it's interesting reading your book too during a pandemic, and just thinking about, I think when we see like people who aren't wearing masks, it's often like people, like, it's usually like, oh, Karens who don't want to wear masks and Trader Joe's. But I find that actually I've like been surprised to find that a lot of people, like I live in a very urban community, like a lot of African American people that I live near don't want to wear masks because there's such an extreme distrust for the government, because of past experiences, that there's like, there's people are afraid of like this idea of this new vaccine and who it's going to be tested on, and those are like legitimate concerns, I think. So it's like, I think this book is like so timely on like multiple levels, which I thought was cool.
So you mentioned distrust, and it made me think a lot about your book and the conversation we're having right now, where you were talking about generational, like, loss of memory. What's the better word for it? It's not loss of memory, but it's still, the truth has been obscured for different generations now of this family. And you were talking about consent as well, and also how you just feel in control whether or not you do or not. And I wanted to know, like, what happens, do you think, in general to a family that is built on distrust. I mean, all families in some ways have their different, just,
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know if it's like, I don't know if the characters, I think it is distrust, but it's also, yeah, I would say my family is very built on like silence and kind of just not discussing certain things. And I think, um, yeah, I think it just becomes this kind of natural family trait that you don't even know that you have, I guess. And I guess that's what I wanted to convey in the book. It's just like, you know, I think that, you know, even me, like, I'm just like naturally, I find myself being naturally secretive for no reason. And I think, yeah, I think it just, as I was writing the book, I just realized that this is something that has been happening for a long time. And I just, now that I'm like identifying it and naming what it is that we're doing, I can start to think about why, you know, which I've never been able to. Yeah, but I think, yeah, distrust is something, yeah, it's something tough, because I feel like it is because of like a legacy of this like kind of negative shared history of colonialism, especially at least in the Caribbean. I feel like it does cause this kind of internal distrust within families. And I think that's what the characters are kind of struggling with. I mean, and sometimes in the Caribbean that's caused some because of like colorism and like different dynamics, or it's you know, if you come from a family where you know, say like, you know, marriage, not everybody was married, and like in my family there's like, we struggle with kind of like the effects of illegitimacy, like, you know, when you have a big extended family, a lot of half siblings, you know, that causes a lot of rivalries too. So yeah, I think that's something that kind of just comes out naturally when I'm writing about the place in the history, I guess.
Yeah, what you're saying, it reminds me a lot of when I was growing up. In my family, we were one of the few families of color in a really rural white area. And people used to talk about how strict my parents were. Like, they wouldn't let me go to a friend's house ever.
Oh, me too.
Unless they met the friends, they'd met the parents. And it would still take like multiple encounters with a friend. And I realized like later, when I was not a child, that it wasn't just about safety. It was also about kind of just a distrust to put like their young Black children in a white space, that they were worried about what could be said to me or things that would be done to me. And I mean, they were really, it's hard to know the difference sometimes between distrust and the caution of knowing you're always going to be outside of something. You're always going to have to be a little wary.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, yeah, that's something that I talk to a lot with my friends who are, you know, who are immigrants, that we weren't allowed to sleep over other people's houses ever. You know, and so, you know, my mother just thought something terrible was going to happen to us. But I thought it was interesting that, you know, like my friends who are American would kind of like laugh about that. And I wonder, you know, I'd wonder like what happened to them? Like, what did they see in their home countries that this is the kind of distrust that they come to America with? But then again, on the flip side, I just wonder if it's like, is it that, you know, children are less protected in those countries, or is America just better at not talking about the things that happen to children? Like, as I get older, I kind of think about that more. But yeah, of course, like, you know, as we're talking about a lot now, especially with the conversation about police brutality, it's like, you know, I think parents who come to America become more and more aware that it's very hard to protect Black children in America. So they'll always have that kind of, you know, natural distrust too.
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to also, because I'm working on a second book now, and I kind of want it to be more of a thriller. So I was really like looking at your novel from, you know, from a craft perspective. You know, and I just wondered how you, like, did it just happen naturally, or did you, you know, read certain authors? How did you learn to like keep that suspense going throughout the novel? Like, what decisions did you have to kind of make?
I mean, some of it was learning from my agent, where one of his bigger known clients is Megan Abbott, and he sent me some of her books. What are they? Give Me Your Hand. She's really popular. And her books are really good too. I was not much of a thriller person, but she kind of converted me into getting like why people love thrillers so much. Her books are so hard to put down that I stayed up all night reading one just because I was like, I have to know. And what I learned a lot about is how you pace chapters. And it was like the hardest lesson I think to learn was I'm so used as a short story writer, especially, to tying things up in a knot. And you kind of have to have either an event or a question that makes a reader want to know more, or to ask another question, or to keep going. And it was really hard to not be repetitive, although sometimes the repeats have to happen because it's pointing someone toward a theme, but it's still like this hard balance. I guess my big answer there is to first start with Megan Abbott, because I learned through reading her. And I also think it is kind of a matter of how you end the chapters. I think that matters more for a thriller or something than how you begin the chapters.
And how did you, I guess, you know, there's kind of, it almost feels like a dream sequence as we go deeper in, like you can't tell what's really happening. And then you also find out that she's forgotten, you know, all these like kind of moments of violence that happened during the experiments. You know, like how did you come up with the kind of details of the experiments? Was it based on your research, or it was just imagination?
Some was research and some was imagination. Like the most fun part of writing this book was writing the research studies, where anytime I got stuck, I would just pull out a note card and write another idea, and then just start detailing out and be like, oh, well, this could be even weirder, and keep pushing and pushing. And it's just, I feel weird that it's my favorite part, because some of them are so gross or so violent, but there was like that pleasure sometimes, you know, Maisy, of like, oh my God, what's in my brain? Let's keep going and find this out.
Yeah, I went back and forth with that. Like for the most part, I think, yeah, like I enjoyed just thinking of a new thing that could occur. But there was some parts where I found like a little difficult to write in my novel. And I think the first time like I put things down on page, it's fun. But then as you have to go back over moments where the characters are either experiencing or talking about violence, it kind of got hard for me in revisions sometimes.
I know we're nearing toward when people get to ask us questions, but I have, based on what you just said, I want to ask one more thing. Okay. How hard was it to write the Irene Betsy, where that scene made me so uncomfortable, where this woman is sure she's possessed by that boy, but she's not. I don't know. Like I read it multiple times to figure out whether or not she was, if I wanted to believe in the possession, or I was like, you know what you're doing. But it was such like a hard scene, because you're letting Irene just be kind of terrible to this person who's weaker than her, but also you fit the balance where I was still on Irene's side. I was not like mad at her. I was more like, I'm seeing you at probably one of the most shameful moments of your life for you. How many times did it take for you to write that scene? How hard was it to like get so raw with them?
You know, I think that one, that started out as a short story that was unconnected to the novel. And I wrote that when I was still in grad school. So it was very different the first time I wrote it, and I had different versions of it over the years. So I think once I decided to bring it into this, like the character wasn't Irene, you know, but I decided to like bring it into the novel and make her Irene. yeah, and that really changed like the kind of dark, it kind of made it a bit darker. So yeah, that was hard. It was kind of like you want her to, you know, she's kind of having like a breakdown or confronting like her anger at her mother, but you don't want her to be like too violent to this real person that she's supposed to be taking care of. Yeah, so I wasn't even sure if I didn't want to go too far because I still wanted the reader to be on her side, so I'm glad. But yeah, it took me, I mean, I wrote this book over the course of 12 years, and I think the first half, I just revised, like, I can't even count. The second half went very quickly, but the first half, I just revised like 100 times, like over and over again, so it took me a long time. How long did it take you to write, before we go to questions, how long did it take you to write this book?
It took me 5 years, okay. Which I thought it was going to end up taking me a lot longer. Books are so weird. Someone told me recently they wrote a book in 6 weeks.
Yeah, I admire that.
Well, I wanted to thank you guys, both of you all, so much for joining us here. This has been really fun, and this has been a great conversation. And thank you all, and I wanted to open it up for any questions from the audience. If you guys are interested, you can please type your questions in the chat, or send Rachel or a message and say you'd like to ask and show up on video. But as people get their thoughts together, one question that we normally ask Booktopia authors, at least when it happened, and I'd like to ask both of y'all, what are some books that you can recommend to our audience here? Some recent or old favorites, or whatever you like.
I think it came out today, actually, Luster by Raven Leilani. I read that recently. That was a really great book. That was also a book that I felt like it feels like I should have read a book about like a black millennial sex life, but I'd never read that before. So it shouldn't be like new ground, but it felt like new ground. And it's really funny. Anything you have, Megan?
I mean, you took my main one. I was
like we have the same books.
What have I read that's not Luster? Oh, I'm probably gonna get shorter for a second. But I've been slowly reading My Baby's First Birthday, which is really good, and it's poetry. And I've been trying to go screen free at night, so I'm getting better about reading my poetry again. And I also really liked Alana Massad's book, All My Mother's Lovers.
Oh, I think this came out today too.
Yeah.
It's Wandering in Strange Lands by Morgan Jerkins, which is nonfiction. And she's kind of tracing the path of the Great Migration that her ancestors took to migrate from the South to, New Jersey.
That just showed up on my doorstep. I'm really excited to read that one with you.
Thank you all. There's a question here in the chat from Elia, and this one's from Maisy. Are there aspects of your being a librarian that helped with composing a novel, or are there aspects that didn't help at all?
The aspects that helped is, it's just very easy to get information, to request whatever obscure book that you want, and to get access to free databases and newspaper databases. I did a lot of historical research, so that definitely helped. And I think it also helps because you're dealing with people all day, and it helps with dialogue. You just, people are cycling through and you're kind of listening to conversations all day, which helps. Aspects that don't help is that, when I decided to be a librarian, I thought that, I would kind of just chill, sit at a desk, shelve, and it would just be quiet and I could write in my downtime. But it's actually, it's more about programming now. And so it's really busy. We're always having events. And so, while I was writing this book, I was also working a lot. So that, that made it harder.
I've got a question for Megan now as we can wait for more questions to come in. Maisy, you said you were working on a thriller. We're excited about it. And Megan, are you working on anything right now? I mean, I know it's a crazy time. We've had authors say they can work and it's just like normal, and some that say they can't do anything at all right now. But
yeah, I'm
working on
writing
it.
my second book too, where I started 2 years ago, where I did the thing like an agent tells you to do, like start your next book so that if this book doesn't sell, you have something else that you'll love and get into. And then everything from like March to probably the start of July, I didn't write. Between pandemic and just social justice issues, and it just seemed like every day a new thing was happening that I had to process and feel and think about, and kind of it just took all of the writing part of my brain away. And then last month, knock on wood, it just kind of happened again, and I was writing very quickly for the first time in a long time, and very just with deep excitement. So yeah, hopefully I have another book in me.
One thing, one difficulty like I've kind of had since writing, trying to write the second book, is that I still feel like the characters from the first book are kind of like in my head. I was wondering if you had that experience, like where the books kind of bleed into each other.
You know, I initially did, especially when I first started, and I had to basically start writing in first person and essentially force myself to meet this new character. And just, I did like a really dorky thing where, you know, those Q&As people used to do on LiveJournal?
Yeah.
I did a Q&A in her voice so that I could get to know who I was talking about.
That's a good idea. But that is something that, because when you asked me the question about the second person, that is kind of what I had to do to finish that chapter. Like I had to keep shifting point of views to kind of, yeah, to really, because I didn't really have the voice in my head. Like it does help to do things like that, I think. Maybe I'll do that for the novel I'm writing now.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah. One thing that we did in grad school, I think, was that I think Stacy Durasmo had us like make a binder for like each character, like, you know, and you cut out photos that represented them and you wrote like a biography and like, you know, just anything. If you found like a flower that reminded you of them, it would like, you know, you'd put it into the binder. And I found that that did help like make the characters feel more real to me.
I love that. I've never heard about doing like a whole binder for a character before. That's awesome. One thing I keep coming back to, like I went to Indiana, and Indiana makes you do multi-genre work. So it's kind of like the nice thing where like I had some really great professors like Ross Gay taught us poetry or like helped us teach. And Ross's whole philosophy of writing is like finding joy and play. So I've been trying to focus more, because Lakewood was so dark, on like playfulness and trying to do things. So like he told us one way to get started writing is to just draw an animal, and you can only use one hand, and you have to just force yourself to draw like a horse. And it's to get you used to the idea of just messing up all the time.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it does really help to like make me feel less self-conscious when I see like this drawing of just a terrible bear or horse or turtle that I've done one-handed, and I can't fix it. I can't do anything, but it's kind of just like this freeing thing to just get started.
And are you like a planner? Do you outline before, or do you just write?
I am not a planner.
Me neither.
I'm so jealous of anyone who can like write the outline, can get everything put into the boxes, and then still feel creative. They're special people.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I keep spending money on these apps, like, you know, these diagram apps on about writing, and I never ever use them.
I never do too, and I try so hard.
And I do, yeah, I think it's also hard to I feel the same thing. Like I want this novel to be more fun because these ghosts was so dark, but yeah, it's hard. I feel like you have like impulses and like specific tastes, you know, and it's hard for me to like shift away from that. So, you know, I think I wanted to write something that was, yeah, more like, yeah, just it's a novel about female like kind of friendship, but you know, there's still like a murder, or you know, I just don't know how to make it like not dark.
I feel like that's fun. I think you can have fun covering up a murder. It will make you close friends for life. You'll always have something that means that you'll be best friends because you can't talk about it to anybody else. I mean, that's still fun. It's lighthearted.
Do you think about, one thing I've thought about too is that, because we were talking about unanswered questions, was, you know, I was like, should I have answered them? I think sometimes I go back and forth. So I've been thinking of, or I've sort of started one story that's like connected to the novel. And I'm like, is anybody waiting for this? Like, I don't know. I mean, do you think that you'll do something else, you know, with the characters, or do you think it's done?
You know, my 90% of the time I'm like, no. And then I was talking to someone and I was thinking a lot how if I ever had to come back to Lakewood and write about it, it wouldn't be really a sequel, but I'm really interested in Desiree, the mother, and her time in the program, and just what it would feel like to know that you've lost 3 years of your life. And I keep coming back to that question because I am interested in her as a person, and I felt like I had to push a lot of her out of the book.
Yeah, yeah. I thought that was a really interesting like revelation too. Not to give it away, but you know, like you know, just to learn that it is why they picked Lena, and it was related to her mother, and also to like think about her like mysterious illness. You know, knowing what happened in those 3 years, we would definitely kind of figure that out too. She's definitely somebody I could see having another chapter or story.
Yeah, I think I'm also scared off because like Margaret Atwood wrote, what was it, The Testaments? And like some of it was really good, and then some of it like it made me not want to read The Handmaid's Tale again, and I'm not sure what about it did that to it. But it's still one of those things where like I had to read it. I couldn't help myself. I had to read and know what happened next. And then I was like, oh, okay, well, now I know too much. Like I think it was the questions at the end of The Handmaid's Tale that kept me wanting to come back to it.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one last question, and it's in our chat, and this is from Fiona. To follow on your discussion of process, what is both of y'all's daily process of writing? And how would you be a different writer if y'all hadn't gone to grad school? Would you be writers?
My daily process, I'm not that disciplined. Like I'm like I think for most of my writing career, like I've had to juggle multiple jobs. So I always like was more of a binge writer. You know, I would just take like a weekend and write as much as I could. So now that I do have time to write every day, I feel like you know, I do write something, but it's not necessarily like working on the novel every day. But yeah, I think I tend to just write for like 10 hours straight rather than writing like a little every day. And how would I have been different if I hadn't gone to grad school? I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of what I definitely learned things in grad school, but I think when I finished from grad school, I still didn't know what made a story a story. Like there are a lot of lessons I think that you learn in the MFA that you don't really know how to apply until like years later. So I don't know. I kind of think, you know, I think even if you don't get an MFA, if you're, you know, I still take like non-credit workshops. I still read a lot of books, in, you know, writer's instruction. You know, I think I might be similar if I hadn't gone to grad school. I don't know. How about you, Megan?
I mean, I think we have really similar processes where I had to work a lot of jobs to like write. And even after the MFA, I was working as like a social media manager and doing like a lot of freelancing and other things while still writing my novel. But so my process wasn't a daily one. And I'm kind of distrustful of daily processes sometimes, just because I think they really privilege more men typically. I think that a lot of female writers, because of just how, especially right now during pandemic, I think the daily at the table is kind of just not, it's not possible. I think I would still be a writer without an MFA, but the difference is I don't think I would have a book yet. I think it would have taken me much longer to do that. And I mean, I was really privileged in the sense that my program gave me enough money to live on very well, and I mean, it's Bloomington, Indiana. And I didn't have to teach the second year at all. And I was there for 3 years, and they only made me teach one class a semester. So I essentially had a huge gift of getting to spend a lot of time just reading and writing for several years and not having to worry about money. And so it's not a thing where I think an MFA teaches you everything you need to know about writing. But I do think that the right one, where if it gives you money and time, it gives you like a 5-year boost that you might not get just because you actually have the time to focus on the thing that you're passionate about.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because that's the thing. I didn't get funding, and so I was working the whole time. So I feel like I was very, it's like it's almost like I had an extra layer of stress when it was supposed to be relieving. It's like I had to write, and then I had to work, and then I had to feel bad that I was spending money on tuition. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
for a career that doesn't necessarily pay. So yeah, I think that's a better distinction. It's like whether you go to a funded program or a program that's not funded makes a big difference.
But I mean, the last thing, Fiona, because I think that's who asked it. I mean, Maisy is right, though. You don't have to get an MFA. There are plenty of things that you can do that will make you still a really talented writer. Someone she and I both know, Maxine Meifeng Chang, whose book, is it The Eighth Girl?
Yeah, The Eighth Girl. It's like,
oh, yeah, it's right there. She's a psychiatrist. She does not have an MFA, and her book is wonderful. She has so much to say about writing. And it took her, again, a significant amount of time to write the book, but she's a writer. She knows just as much as I think I do, and I have a master's degree in it.
Well, it's 6 o'clock, and I want to thank you both so much. This has been a real pleasure tonight. Maisy, Megan, this has been great. Thank you guys for joining us for another fun Northshire Live. And thank you all.
Thanks everybody for coming and listening to us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks so much to Maisy and Megan, and to everyone else. We will see you next time we are back here for Northshire Live. We'll be back again on Thursday of this week, and hopefully we'll see you again real soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.
Y'all take care. Thanks.